Hey there, thanks for joining us on Pixel Sift this week. As usual, we'll be looking at the news and issues from the video game world. My name is Mitch, and this week I'll be taking over the driver's seat from Gianni, who happens to be on holiday in sunny Hawaii. Not really sure what I think about that, but you know. Alright, anyway, joining me this week, as well as Scott, we have a special guest presenter, Brad Power.
G'day.
Hey, man. And Scott, you know,
hello.
What's up?
Yep.
Brad is a lecturer in games, art, and design at Murdoch University, and I just realized might be one of the more qualified people we've ever had on here. Anyway, this week, we have a couple of interviews. We have an interview and a couple of topics.
I think everyone has a lot of trouble talking about their PhD without and making sense of it to people who aren't kind of stuck in the middle of it.
That was Lisa Evans, and we'll be finding more about her later.
We'll also be discussing the Australian government's recent funding cuts to over 65 arts organisations and its effect on the Australian gaming industry.
Lastly, we're going to be talking about beta burnout, where the timing or length of beta access for a game can actually negatively affect its impact at release.
All that today and more on episode 33 of Pixel Sift. Let's jump into it.
You're listening to Pixel Sift, or you might be watching Pixel Sift on Twitch. Pixel Sift.
So starting off today's episode with something a little bit serious. Since our last political-related topic covering the Senate inquiry into the video game industry, the Australian government has cut funding to the arts, with 65 separate organisations losing funding. Many of these organisations will be unable to survive, and with our government leading towards high art, a much beloved gaming industry here in Australia faces an uncertain funding future. Now, this is nothing new to us, especially people in the arts and culture industry. It was just 2 years ago we were dealing with the government cutting $100 million from the arts, and we lost our Australian Interactive Fund. But it's kind of sad at the moment because it felt like we were on the way to something better. And now this.
Yeah, I think it can definitely be one of those things that makes you go, oh no, are we going to go through all this again? When these kinds of, initial slow snowball effect trickles of problems start seeping in, and you start wondering about the future. But I think the other thing is that it's really important for communities in Australia to have support, because it's the communities that end up funding games, and it's only when we work together in Australia that we are able to actually push through and get games out there. So when funding cuts like this happens, it's not that it's affecting a single games company, it's that it's actually affecting a whole community.
Yeah, it shines that doubt for the whole community. It's instability, sorry. This is something kind of we've been looking for here.
It does seem that our games culture here is just in its infancy at this point, and I think it needs all the help it can get. And it seems like we were getting the games culture was getting the scraps what was left from screen, and that seems like what I was interpreting.
I mean, there's been a push for the certain kind of allowances that are made for the TV and film industry to be pushed onto the gaming as well. What with travel allowances to just to keep up to date. But with the Senate inquiry that we spoke about just a couple of weeks ago, I was really I felt that there was a really positive push that we've kind of been missing since the removal of the Interactive Fund. And like I said, this just kind of derails that whole movement. But it's about, I feel like it's about the game industry needing to be taken seriously as a viable economic kind of resource and export, because like I said, we're only growing, and infancy is probably the wrong word, I reckon, when you said that. I'd say the Australian gaming industry is really great. It's been strong, and it's just finally getting noticed, I think, that is the real thing.
Right.
I think that's absolutely true. I think it's all about critical mass. It's about the community, whether it's in Melbourne or whether it's in Perth or wherever, or just Australia as a whole, being big enough to be visible and visible enough to get funding. And in cases like this, when funding gets cut, that affects the ability of that community to exhibit their works or get local or international exposure, get talked about on, Pixel Sift, or get picked up by something, Kotaku or whatever. It's a really big setback. And as an example, in WA, we get some funding, but it's quite hard compared to places like Victoria, which do have a reasonable amount of funding for arts. So and that enables events like Free Play and even things like GCAP and PAX to kind of exist because, Melbourne has that kind of, or Victoria has that kind of arts fund. So it's hard here in WA. So as an example, just locally, if you look at Let's Make Games and the Perth Games Festival, which they've run successfully the past couple of years, and they've grown that each year. And this is just volunteers. It's not coming with any particular funding. And they've grown that to the point now where it's starting to be visible. It's grown each year. People are starting to take notice, and it's at the point where local or state government could actually start giving it some funds. If something like that down the track gets cut, it's almost like it kind of wastes all that effort that's been done to push something to get as visible as it can be. That all kind of goes down the drain when the funding goes away.
Yeah, you're right. And the gaming industry is not alone here. The whole,
Right.
so much of the arts community in Australia. I mean, we're fighting it with community radio, and like you said, it feels like we were just doing this, 12 months ago, 24 months ago, even longer than that. And it feels like these kind of the digital realm for community radio and just the games industry in general really need to kind of be taken seriously for what they're pushing forward. I've got some nice stats here from the research released by the Interactive Games and Entertainment Association. Found that the industry saw digital sales growth by 27% over the last year to 1.589 billion, to surpass traditional retail sales. And these are stats from last year, I must say. But retail sales also increased by 2% to 1.243 billion. So this is a growing industry with serious money to splash around.
To play
Yes,
devil's
sir.
advocate here, do we know how funding works, let's say in America, where the video game industry is massive and brings in the dollars?
I have no idea.
One could argue maybe that if it was such a viable industry, why does it need funding?
Yeah, I think in the US, you're looking at it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges.
Yes,
It's such a different environment over there, and there is a lot more funding. There's a lot more venture capital. There's, there's all that kind of stuff. If you're talking about indies, right? Because obviously
Right.
the big studios are established,
Yeah.
and this is the point. This is all about a tree that's established versus a little sapling that you're trying to get off the ground. What we're looking at is you don't want. I wouldn't want people to think, the games industry is looking for a handout here. This is something that we need. It's like Kickstarter, you need something to get off the ground. Once this is off the ground in Australia, the community can start giving back in the form of, taxes and sales and all that kind of stuff. It will contribute to the economy, but it's something where you're kind of denying it the chance to grow in the first place. We're looking at a case since the GFC happened, in sort of 2009, 2010. It feels a bit like a burn back, a lot of AAA or however you want to call it, studios that did exist in Australia at the time kind of got, decimated. And that's turned into a lot of talented people either left the country or they started little indies here. And those are like little, sort of like the regrowth forest, right? And they're kind of starting to grow. They're going to get to a point soon where they're flourishing. And I think that's when it's going to be payback time for Australia, and we're going to see a really great games industry. And what we do need some support until that time.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely more to talk about, in the future regarding that one.
Look, I don't think as I said, we've been discussing this kind of almost on the date for the last year, and then the year before that, and then the year before that. So we will come back to this again, when it's sadly.
Excellent. Let's check out our next topic.
Pixel Sift. Pixel Sift. No, seriously, Pixel Sift. No, seriously.
Pixel Sift.
Yeah, so earlier this week, Gianni spoke to Lisa Evans about her experiences in development and in video game development and finding a place for herself in the industry. So let's check that out.
I think everyone has a lot of trouble talking about their PhD without and making sense of it to people who aren't kind of stuck in the middle of it. I'm Lisa Evans. I've had a bit of a, what would you call it, meandering kind of career in kind of both games and science, because I started off doing physics when I was at uni, back in the 90s. I wanted to be an astrophysicist, but then ended up deciding not to pursue that and getting involved in 3D animation instead. And I've been working in animation and games since about 2003. Sometimes in, various little kind of game companies around Perth, but also sometimes doing more kind of film type work. Yeah, I basically wanted to combine, the work that I've done in games with just my kind of interest and passion for science and wanting to look at how you can use games to communicate science. It was really interesting to me looking at the ways that people are kind of struggling to communicate big global problems like global warming and the rising sea levels.
When you talk about science and things not being communicated well, what are some of the problems you think that science has had in getting their message across to people and communicating these big ideas?
Part of it comes down to there's two basic models in science communication. There's a bit of a tension between them at the moment. And the traditional one that's been around for decades is described as a public understanding of science model, where the idea is that there's this public, which are people who aren't scientists, and they have they're treated as though they have something wrong with them. There's something missing in their understanding, and that just needs to be corrected. And so the idea there is that science communication is about basically giving them information and just fixing that, what they call the deficit. The deficit model actually is very ineffective because it treats people as though there's this big inequality in the power relationship between scientists and non-scientists. When you've disempowered people, they're not very receptive to what you're trying to say. They just a lot of people will just reject it. The alternative model to that is that's coming out now is the public engagement in science model, where the idea is to try and put everyone on more of an equal footing. So scientists and everyone who isn't a scientist are all members of the same community and all faced by the same serious problems. And really, it should just be a collaborative effort to understand what the problems are and how they affect everyone, and what's really the biggest priorities to solve. And so, it's you've got a dialogue or even a group effort to solve problems rather than this kind of monologue where it's just information going from scientists to members of the public. So that's one of the ideas kind of at the core of what I think is the whole point of using games to communicate science is that games are engaging, and you want to engage people in the problems rather than just kind of lecture them about them. My aim was to take some software that has actually been used in scientific research, which is it's called Planet Simulator. I looked at a lot of different models that have been used for modeling global circulation and the Earth's atmosphere and things, but also with vegetation and things like that built in. And so I found one that's a simulation of intermediate complexity, which makes it kind of relatively easy for me to use, but it still needs to be run on a supercomputer. You can't build a real-time planet simulation type game around that software, but you need software of that level of complexity in order to really explore the mechanics of all the different variables that I wanted people to be able to just kind of play with in terms of, moving a planet closer to the sun or further away and changing the amount of land and water and things like that on it, and choosing the level of carbon dioxide and things like that in the atmosphere. It kind of turned out that I just had to pre-simulate a whole bunch of different choices and then build basically a choose-your-own-adventure game where you just have to make these choices and then see what the consequences are, and then find a pathway through all the different simulations until you come up with a planet at the end that's livable because you're a planet engineer making a new home for an alien species that have lost their former home.
So when you're designing a game like that, was there a way that you could have dialed it down, or do you need the complexity of proper planet modeling?
Yeah, that's most of the games out there that explore kind of the same issues. They use much simpler models, and the problem though is that I think that to really give people the sense that they can play, in different senses of the word, with a planet, you kind of have to have a bit more scope to make bigger changes and take bigger risks, and then see the kind of non-linear effects that's going to have, because the more complex it is, the more you start to see these non-linear effects of different feedback cycles and, runaway processes. So, in the game, even as I was doing the simulations for the game, I just kept surprising myself with a lot of the outcomes. If I created a planet that was basically like Earth, but without any carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then add oceans to it, it just immediately turns into a snowball planet, just completely frozen over. And I wasn't expecting that to happen right away. And so there's things like that that are just really surprising that you're not really going to get if you have a much simpler simulation, which you can then, you can run it in real time and build a real-time simulation game around it, but won't necessarily get those really surprising results.
And with people playing your games, have you seen sort of, interesting stuff from the way that they are actually interacting with it and the way that people kind of approach it?
What kind of surprised me was that, people get very intimidated and don't really want to make choices that seem like the wrong choices, which I was hoping people would want to then, explore all the wrong, quote, wrong choices, because they're not really wrong. They're just, I wanted them to be there to kind of explore and play with. But, a lot of people just, even when they're just playing a game by themselves and there was, as part of a study, you're feeling like someone's watching you, so you don't want to do something that seems stupid. But, there's this level of self-consciousness that a lot of people have, and so I need to make it a lot friendlier and less intimidating. But then people who didn't have that effect, they started really playing with it and trying to break it and trying to see how far they could push it. And unfortunately, I didn't really allow them enough scope to be wrong, which was one of my big revelations when I finally had a play test.
When you're designing a study like this, all sort of studies have to go through sort of an ethics board and all these sort of things. What's the process of kind of approaching an ethics board and explaining your project to them? Is it still relatively simple and still very, within the sort of, knowledge base of the people who kind of tick things off?
It was mostly relatively simple because I was mainly drawing from methods that have been used by other research teams in the past, and they'd obviously had their, ethics approval in the past, and you'd demonstrate that we weren't really doing anything different. But it did turn into, there was quite a bit of debate, apparently, over the use of games in research and how there's this sense that games can really change people's behaviour and kind of change the way they think about particular things. And in actual fact, when you look at the evidence, it is actually really hard to change people's behaviour using games. I mean, there's been all this research on violent games and whether that makes people violent, and a lot of it has shown that actually, for the most part, it doesn't. And in some people, maybe it actually gives them an outlet that means that they're less violent in real life, things like that. So, it did take a little bit of discussion over that aspect of using games in research. Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. And when you do talk about serious games, a lot of people just assume you mean educational games for kids in schools. And I get that a lot of the time. And I'm just, I haven't really got a particular age range that I want to target with my game, but it is really aimed at adults as well as, any kids that might want to play it. And that's a very interesting concept for a lot of people.
And that was Lisa Evans, and you can find out more about her work at worldofchoices.org. And I encourage you to sign up and have a go and get involved with the project. Pixel Sift!
It's not Pixel Sieve, it's Pixel Sift.
Pixel Sift!
So, what we're going to talk about now is beta burnout. And many games these days, particularly large, complex online games, and also really big, eagerly anticipated releases, offer a beta period. And that's where people can download and play the game before release. And it's supposed to be a good thing. It's supposed to help the developers get feedback from the public before the game is released. But what happens when the gamers hammer the game during beta, and by the time release comes around, people are over it, and the servers are a ghost town? What do we think?
It seems to be happening a lot more nowadays when betas seem to be almost like they don't even consider them test periods. It's pretty much the game at this point, and people are basing their opinion on the beta so hard that they pretty much consider it a release.
Yeah, so do you have any particular game in mind when you're talking about this?
I think a couple that come to mind that fell prey to this particular beta burnout concept that, by the way, I may have thought of just then. The Crew, the Ubisoft car simulator.
Yeah.
That allowed you to form like a raid party of cars.
Yeah.
And Evolve.
Right, Evolve, yeah.
Yeah, which both, I think, fell on their face for two reasons. The crew, I think, offered, a little bit too much of its own gameplay in the beta period. Like, you could explore almost the entire map, and everything was pretty much in there. And people realized that maybe it wasn't really worth shelling out the $100 for when it actually did come out, or I think it was maybe 80 or 90 when it came out. But the Evolve beta, because it's primarily multiplayer, all of it was in there, and you'd expect it to be in there. Well, most of it anyway. But I think there were too many betas. There was like a pre-alpha, an alpha, a beta. Early access beta, sorry, then a public one, and then I think the public one went on for almost 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And by then, people were very excited, me included. I couldn't wait to play it, but after the beta period, it just fizzled out almost.
Everyone had lost interest.
And everybody had their fill.
Yeah, I guess one thing to wonder about is the scope of the game. So you have obviously baited for games before, and you'll have a different perspective than just the average Joe that hasn't been involved in the beta. So there's some people that aren't being exposed to the game before release. But I feel like there's a parallel here. When you sometimes see the teaser for a movie, you're going to see a movie and you see the trailer for a movie that's coming out, and you kind of get all the plot points, and maybe they even use the funniest lines in the trailer, and you're kind of sitting there going, why would I pay to see this movie now? I've kind of gotten all the bits,
It's that fine line, I guess, with having to release something out there into the world where you need people to be interested in it, and but you don't want to kind of play all your cards, so your game's eventually basically just being defeated in its beta stage.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
That's it. It's just towing that fine line between giving the people enough to keep them interested, and not giving them too much to ruin them for the actual launch.
Right. So to put on my professional hat here, and talk about how awesome I am as a game developer, right? And having been involved with this process for the release of games before, beta is really meant to serve a purpose. It's meant to serve a testing purpose, and we kind of talked about that. But really what we're talking about now is the idea of beta almost as a marketing tool. It's almost as a sneak peek of a game, right? And that's kind of how it's being used. So And you mentioned a couple of things, alpha and pre-alpha and all these kind of different stages that a beta can go through. And I think one of the problems we're seeing here is that those stages aren't being necessarily handled correctly. And I think an example of a game that's done this right is Overwatch. Overwatch, I think, has nailed the way in which a beta happens. And I guess to explain how they've done that, I need to make the distinction between alpha and closed beta and open beta. Right. So alpha is when you have a game it's really so early that it's not really for public consumption. It's just for the devs and maybe a couple of closed people to test. That doesn't stop people releasing games early access into alpha, right? And maybe we shouldn't have a conversation about that because I'll start steaming through my ears. Closed beta is when you release to a group of people that's private and exclusive, and it's small enough, or it's big enough, maybe is the better term. It's big enough that it's enough people to test out the game without releasing it to the public, okay? And that period, that closed beta period that is exclusive, that most people don't know about, you want to go on, I would say, for as long as possible. And what I mean by that is as long as it takes to work out all the kinks and balancing issues from the game.
And this is primarily multiplayer.
And that's primarily multiplayer. Yep. Some games that are single player would go out for closed beta, but really it's going to be the multiplayer games because multiplayer introduces so much complexity, especially in terms of the meta game, right? And the idea of what strats and tactics and different combinations of items can I use to wreck other people that the developers didn't realize that we were going to be able to do. So you get all that sorted out during closed beta, and that's maybe it could be anywhere from a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand people. That's not going to affect your sales at launch. This is just a small portion.
Right.
That got me thinking when you said specifically like public beta. It was like that kind of defies the point of being beta. And for me, in general, like the general public shouldn't be playing this game until it's it's actually ready. And that's where you're going to get all these people getting over the game before it's even launched because they're playing it in an incomplete form. So their opinion's tarnished before they even get there. The closed beta is the most important bit there. That's where everything should get nutted out and kinked out. Like before it even, there shouldn't even it should be so good that the need for a follow-on beta isn't even really necessary.
That's exactly right. So that open beta really does become a sneak peek, and it does become a marketing tool.
And that's it, just a small sneak peek.
The idea is you don't want, as a games company, you don't want to learn anything new during the open beta period. You want to learn things during the closed beta. You don't have enough time. Look at Overwatch. It comes out this week, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
In the next couple of days, and it's just come off open beta. So do you honestly think they're changing anything between open beta and release?
No.
The only question they would have had to answer is how can our servers handle the load? And this is Blizzard, right? This is Blizzard. They know what actually the Diablo 3 release was a bit of a problem. But this is exactly what you're saying. By open beta, you are releasing a polished game, and you should be doing it for a couple of days.
It's a test run to make sure that, like you said, the servers and everything, and you've got the right load.
So it would seem that the more you release, maybe the less time.
Correct.
Open beta,
Yep.
and the less you release, maybe more time.
Yep.
And maybe identify exactly what you want to achieve. And I think gamers need to remember that the beta is actually not for them.
Right.
Really, it's not. I mean, they can participate, and yes, it might be fun, and the end result, the end result is for them ultimately. But the idea of a beta is to teach the company something.
Absolutely.
And when people base their opinion off the game because of the beta, I think it's largely incorrect.
Yeah. And I think that's definitely what applies to the closed beta. I mean, if you've signed up for one of those things, it really does look like this is about a feedback mechanism for the company. Whereas an open beta, they don't really care.
No. Yeah, like they should already
they shouldn't,
be.
Yeah,
neither should they. Exactly.
I guess a couple of games, so Overwatch is another game that did it well. I particularly think the Destiny did it well in the beta. Like they offered us a decent amount of an okay amount of the story, and all of the multiplayer you could ever want.
As far as a beta Burnout goes, I feel Homefront had piles of negative feedback, and I didn't actually participate in that myself, so I don't know. Right. But I feel that was a perfect example of something put forward to too many people too early. Like, because you just had that many unhappy people like quitting after the first match. Even less than that, you had people actually rage quitting after 5 minutes, and then jumping to Reddit to take it up there.
Right?
That's bad for business.
Was that due to the server not working? Or?
That was due to last gen graphics. The whole thing being mediocre at best. The servers were a bit connection to servers were buggy. There was, and I don't know, lots of things. Like I said, it's a shopping list of problems. For that one, that was just one little example I dug up.
Well, in contrast, so we were just talking about Overwatch, and Blizzard have really, they're the masters, right? And I did say, the Diablo 3 launch was a bit problematic. People couldn't get on servers at the time. Then they've learnt from that, right? So the Overwatch open beta went super smoothly, and I guarantee the release will go super smoothly.
Yeah, everyone seems super happy about Overwatch.
Right, and that's because it did spend a long time in closed beta. It's been a fair while there, and that was I didn't have a beta key. Maybe, I don't think, did you guys have beta keys for closed?
Yeah.
No.
Right. But I jumped in and opened. Yeah.
Right. So it's a closed community that had that, and that's not going to really negatively affect their sales.
Yeah, I think Blizzard absolutely knows what's what.
Yeah, they do it well.
Anyway, awesome. Did you know Pixel Sift is available on other platforms? You can find previous episodes on iTunes, Pocket Casts, YouTube, and on the Pixel Sift website. Thanks again for joining us on Pixel Sift. We've hoped you've enjoyed the show. It has come to an end, sadly. And thank you very much for Brad for joining us.
No worries.
Thank you, Brad.
As usual, you can find links to all the episodes all the links to the items we talked about on this episode at www.pixelsift.com.au. Scott, where can people find us on social media?
Mitch, people can find us at facebook.com/pixelsift, twitter.com/pixelsift, twitch.tv/pixelsift, and youtube.com/pixelsiftau.
And Brad, if people want to listen to other episodes of the show, where should they go?
They should go to pixelsift.com.au.
You can go to website to stream the episodes.
Yep, and
subscribe as a podcast either on iTunes, Pocket Cast, or using the RSS link on our page.
Awesome. And then while you're on iTunes, if you give us a review and a star rating, that would be great. And as Gianni is on holiday, we're going to use this time to have a little time off to ourselves. Don't worry, though. We'll be back in a couple of weeks and with the regular show. If you like what you've been listening to, make sure to tell your friends. And thanks again. We'll catch you in a few weeks on Pixel Sift.
Catch you later.